Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Hopefully Interesting. Hopefully, you keep tuning in. You liked what we said before. This is your first time finding us. Welcome. Hopefully, you find what we're about to say interesting. Most of what we talk about is sword related talk or talk involving sword shaped objects as Mark starts playing with his saber. Today, we're going to be talking about the differences in drilling, sparring, and actually going and fighting in a tournament, and what those mean and how those three pieces kind of come together to create a complete fighter, I guess, or a complete picture. So yeah, that's our topic. There's a lot of different places you can start. Drills are probably a good first place to start, but before you get there, you probably want to, as Mark would say, read a manual.
Right. Yeah, that's going to be reading a manual, or most people's introduction into like HEMA, for example, will be going to a school and taking a couple lessons before they even pick up the manual.
Fair enough. Yeah. And I guess I can talk about some of the stuff that what I stumbled upon, what I decided I liked, and then your recommendation, right? I guess that would be a good place to start. So,
yeah, how did you get to where you are with manuals and stuff?
right. If you didn't catch our first episode, I've been doing stuff with swords and sword-related objects for too long because I am old. Started off with like an SCA light group, moved into lightsabers and glow sticks. Now I'm part of the Saber Legion and dipping my toes into the waters that are HEMA. With that in mind, I went to Google and I typed HEMA books or like intro HEMA books, and this came up. Historical European Martial Arts in its Context. It's written by Richard Marsden. Already being somebody that leaned towards one-handed fighting, I knew I wanted to do something like that. He has a nice little overview, breaks down a bunch of stuff about HEMA and some stuff that's not even HEMA-centric, but the section really that I paid attention to was the section on the masters and their treaties, and he breaks it down by regions. And then before I even in earnest started talking to you, I went to YouTube and typed in HEMA one-handed fighting. And that led me to the Academy of Historical Fencing and a series of several videos they did on a British military saber. Scholar Gladiatoria was another place I found myself, mostly looking at gear, because he talks about that quite a bit, as well as historical stuff. Doesn't do quite as many technique videos. If you go way back into his channel, he did. But he's moved away from that, sadly, which makes me very sad. And then after talking to you, I picked up this beauty, Cold Steel from Alfred Hutton. And this is more in the
yours doesn't look nearly as worn as mine does.
No, and I don't have nearly as many page markers.
All the page markers.
I probably need to read it more is what that means.
Right. Yeah. I mean, don't we all?
Yeah. So, and I think much like you, I really enjoy the things he said, the ideas he has, cites other masters. He talks a lot about the Italians in this book, and Italian fencers, and some more Hutton books.
Right. And so to caveat that as well, Richard's book is a great place to start for the masters and manuals and stuff like that. Another option is Old Swordplay by Alfred, or Techniques of the Great Masters by Alfred Hutton. What's great about this is not this isn't really going to teach you how to be a sword fighter, right? But chapter 1, introduction, chapter 2, the two-handed sword, chapter 3, the rapier dagger, chapter 4, the broadsword and buckler, so on. And what's great is he'll go through each one. So like the two-handed sword, he talks about Morasso, Degrassi, Joachim Meyer, Jacob Sutter, and Alfari. He also references his own book, Cold Steel, because this was written after, talking about the Great Stick. And then he has pictures, lots of pictures about the different manuals, and he'll give you like 1 or 2 techniques. Broadsword and buckler, same way. So he talks about the different masters, a little bit of how they did things, right? And it gives you a starting place to point you in the direction of some of the different manuals out there, because when you're first going to a site to download manuals, or Amazon to buy manuals especially, or any other website to buy manuals, you're like, oh, well, I'm interested in military saber. Well, let me Google military saber manuals. And you do that, and it comes up with 30 different options. Go to your bookstore or your PDF store or whatever, and if you can't find it for free, and you find out that each one of those is, $60+ or $30+ or whatever. Luckily, the Hutton ones are all pretty cheap. I think the most expensive one I bought was 25-ish, so.
And I think both with Hutton's book and the book from Richard Marsden, the Marsden book seems similar to the Hutton book. Doesn't really go into technique, but you can read it, see, oh, hey, that's the way I want to play the game, inform a decision, and then you can kind of maybe narrow down more of what you want to do. And talking about like electronic books or PDFs or downloading something on the computer, I'm one of those people where you bugged me for the better part of a year and a half, almost 2 years, to read this. And I had the link. And then I would re-ask you for the link because it would get lost in Messenger. It took me actually buying the book to actually read the book, because I am one of those old men that I need to physically flip through a book to read it.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, another great option on that end is to print off your manual. Because, like I said, a lot of these are available for free. This is Joseph Swetnam's The Noble and Worthy Science of the School of the Noble and Worthy Science of Defense. Again, all the tabs, because who wants to spend 2 hours trying to find a specific source of something, but then highlighted on top of that, right? So this is another great option. Just have a binder clip. I should throw this in a proper binder, make it look all pretty, but haven't gotten around to it.
So first step then, before we even drill, I guess, first step is figure out what you want to do, maybe read a manual.
I think
maybe around the time you do that or before you do that, maybe you go to a HEMA class and maybe that's what sparks it, or maybe you want to get into HEMA and you pick up a manual. But those 2 steps are probably going to happen fairly close to one another.
Right. And I do recommend finding a HEMA school first, if that's what you're interested in. Or if you're interested in the Saber Legion, going and talking to someone at a meet, finding out the reading of the rule set at least. If you're interested in Kendo, taking some Kendo classes before you do your studying, just because it puts you in a context and makes sure that you're not wasting your time. I mean, studying is never wasted time, but you might like up here, I went to one class or one day at a HEMA school which is the Sacramento Prefecture. I believe is how you say it, and they teach Meyer. But my background is Fiore, based on the Getty manuscript. They teach Joachim Meyer. And so if I was really like, oh, Fiore is what I want to learn, like I'm dead set on, studying Fiore, and then I go to a HEMA school and I can't learn Fiore there. Now they are open to other styles than their own, but as an example, right? Your school might not be open to other styles or things like that. So if you're interested in learning longsword, I recommend attending the school and then figuring out what flavor of longsword they do, then going and finding the manual on that. But if you're studying at home, as most of us are right now, the plague going on, most of us are studying at home. So maybe what I would recommend is doing your research, like you were saying, find a manual that fits the game that you want to play. And then from there, read the manual at least once through. Then go on YouTube, go to your classes, go to talk to people on Facebook, get the information of how other people are doing it, and then use that to inform your own opinion. I think one of the worst things that you can do is to completely rely on your instructor for your entire opinion on a subject matter. You should be at least forming your own opinion to some degree.
That's fair. And so I guess that's kind of a primer, right? That kind of gives you a context or a framework. So now you know what you want to do. Now we're getting into actually what we said we would talk about this week, which is drilling,
Right.
sparring, and the tournament mindset, or how you apply things in a tournament.
Right.
And drilling is basically just practice. It's
Yeah.
reading the manual, seeing the things talked about, explained in the manual, and then practicing them in probably the most controlled environment that you will get to execute the techniques.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I have been doing martial arts on and off mostly for the last, about 15 years, and to one degree or another. And it's always about drilling, right? You learn the technique and then you drill the technique. And that, like you said, it's a safe way to learn the thing, right? And sparring or drilling really comes in two forms, that being with resistance and without resistance. And all the techniques should be learned to begin with without resistance, because if I'm trying to learn something brand new and you are instead just stabbing me in the face the entire time, I'm not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
If you're going 100% as hard as you can in drilling, when I'm trying to figure out something, I'm not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
So it's important to, when you start off, you can just go through the motions, get the motions down, get a basic understanding of it. But then probably more important than that, and that should be like at most like an hour of drilling, and for several techniques, like that should be done in the first 10, 20 passes of a drill, if it's not overly complicated. And then after that, that's when you start ramping it up. Maybe the next 20 are done with a little more resistance. Like, okay, now they're actually trying to block. Not fully, but they're not going with it. If you bump my saber offline as a beat, I might actually I'll move my saber, but you actually have to give it good contact, and then you get to a level with, again, using a beat as an example, is maybe it's your second day, or maybe it's a couple hours in, that you give it a beat and, oh, you didn't beat my saber hard enough, so I stab you, or I just don't move it. So it needs to be drilled with resistance, and a lot of martial arts schools don't. I would recommend that anyone, if you're going to a HEMA study group or a charter in TSL or whatever, if they're not training with resistance, maybe not on day one, but if they're not training at all with resistance, it's probably not the right school.
Right. And the school that I go to down here, their big thing is when you're running through the drills, actually present a threat, right? They're doing a drill and you're giving a cut this way. Actually bring your cut like you're going to hit them, because if my cut's should be going here, and we're teaching somebody how to block, and I'm softballing it and knocking down things, and I'm softballing it and stopping it way out this way.
Right.
It's teaching them to block an exaggerated motion. It's nothing that's going to actually help them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's plenty of ways to softball or to train without resistance, and all of them are harmful after the first 20 times you drill it, and I'm saying 20 is like a super complicated movement. Like for a beat, for example, you can jump straight into training with resistance. It's not exactly a complicated thing. You hit the weak of their blade with the strong of your blade, hopefully, or the weak of your blade, depending on the system. And then you go from there. It's not exactly hard. Some of the winding and binding that you get in the Lichtenhauer or Meyer traditions, those can be a little more complicated. Maybe you want to slow it down and really make sure that the student does it that 20 times or whatever and get it right. But yeah. But like Joe was saying, you need to be able to present that threat, is if you don't present a threat, then you're blocking exaggerated movements, like you were saying. And if I'm in a fight, and especially in a competition, and my opponent throws a feint, which is an exaggerated motion that's not theoretically going to hit me, and I go for the block, I'm going to get hit somewhere else. I'm giving them what they want from that feint. So yeah, it's important to train or to drill with resistance.
Yeah. And try to, again, we're in the most controlled, theoretically, the safest space and environment we're going to be doing these techniques, whether it's with steel, synthetic trainers, lightsabers, buffers, whatever. The drill's the time that you want to do it right. Because there's some kind of saying, right? Miss small in drills, miss big in the game, or whatever, right? So, so you want to try
aim
to
small, miss small, aim big, miss big.
Yeah. So, kind of like that. Take advantage that it's again, theoretically, the safest space we're going to be doing this kind of stuff in. And don't cheat yourself. Don't cheat your partner.
Right. And that's probably the biggest thing. If you want to just go through the motions, more power to you. Maybe you're more thinking of, in more traditional, Oriental or Asian styles, you get forms, right? You go through essentially a choreographed dance. And that can be really meditative. That can be good exercise. That can be really beneficial in a lot of ways. And if you want to do that without resistance, then you're just going through the motions, more power to you, because at least you're getting up and moving. But if you're actually looking at it from a standpoint of sparring or tournaments or self-defense. You could be taking like Krav Maga or something like that. Then you're really doing your partner, your training partner, a disservice by not implementing resistance. Now, like I mentioned before, the first couple times, do it without resistance so they can get the movement right and not build bad habits. But that shouldn't be the norm. That should be the exception.
Yeah. And then, unless you have anything else to add to drills, we kind of move on to our next piece of the
We
puzzle.
beat that dead horse,
We beat it real good.
right?
Next thing is we move into sparring, which
Right.
could be similar, kind of adjacent to partner drills. And anything, any slop maybe, any softballs maybe your training partner was showing you, this is where those things are going to start to show themselves. And again, it's not the end of the world, but it's starting to get to the point where it's maybe, if you want to be competitive, it's maybe starting to become mission critical to fix those gaps or those holes in your game, because if you want to move on to the next step after this, when you're engaging in competitive tournaments and stuff like that, things need to be hammered out here. And this is also where you're going to see if something that you've read on paper and done in the most controlled environment you can do in your club, can you perform it while somebody else is swinging a sword or sword-like object at you?
Right.
That's kind of the first test that the technique has. Does it hold up? Is sparring.
Right, exactly. And that's something to keep in mind too. Like, so talking about a logical progression, right? You studied, you read the thing, then you got you got with a partner, you trained the thing for, X amount of days or whatever. Then you trained with resistance and it's like, okay, I feel like I got this down. Then you jump into the ring and you try it and it doesn't work, because now your opponent is trying to hit you, because they're trying to train their offense and defense while you're training your offense and defense. And so it's kind of that practical application, right? So a lot of people will then go, oh, well, this technique doesn't work. And does it though? So I would say after, hopefully your technique works for you, right? Hopefully you get in the ring, your opponent's actively trying to hit you, and you can, parry and riposte and do your technique as you need to do. And it works for you. But what if it doesn't? I think the worst thing that you can do is to then blame the technique, because there are some authors that were full of hot air, they didn't know what they were talking about. But for the most part, most of these manuals, they know what they're talking about. They won X amount of duels, or they spent, X amount of years as a soldier or whatever. And so most of these authors know what they're talking about. So I would say while you're going on to the sparring, make sure to have faith in the system, and if you try it in every which way, because maybe it wasn't the right context. Maybe you tried to throw, your parry into a riposte while your opponent was lunging with a stab, and you didn't parry far enough. Okay, that's your own fault. So you need to go back, be honest with yourself, and be pragmatic about your training, and say, when it wasn't my fault, when was it the manual's fault? And then if you try that technique in every way possible, and you've given it the time in drilling, and you've given it the time in sparring, and then you've tried everything you can think of and it still doesn't work, and you've talked to other people, then cross it off, throw it out, write it off as inefficient. But definitely when you're sparring, have faith in the system, but then again, also don't assume the system is always 100% perfect.
Right. And also keep in mind that for the most part, most of us are reading these manuals that were written in a time period where people were being given techniques to make sure they get home at the end of the day. And when you're
Mhm.
using a steel trainer like Mark's holding there, or a lightsaber, or a glow bat, or a boffer, or you're playing with synthetics or in the SCA or what have you,
Maybe you're doing LARP, right?
right?
Who knows?
And I mean, you are at that point, you're playing a sport, you're playing a game. Um, Everybody would react far differently in practice and in tournaments if both people had sharps. And if there was a risk of, oh God, I might lose a hand, finger, limb, whatever. And so some things don't stand up that were in the manuals, potentially because people are willing to be more reckless because there's not that fear of a loss of life or limb.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
that's where I guess we start to find some of the holes in the system, the things that don't translate from self-defense with weapons, sharp, scary weapons, to the sport or game that we play now.
Right. Yeah, and what's interesting too is both Swetnam and Hutton comment on that, right? Swetnam talks about the duel, and he says that when you meet a man in cold blood in the morning, both being sober, that they will act differently than in the gym, essentially, in the school. And Hutton also criticizes the English because at the time in the fencing room, it seemed like Continental side was satisfied with like the smaller hits, right? Something like that. Maybe with more force, but then you go to England and they're, oh well, you need to strike deep and you need to strike with the, up here, further up the blade, and you need to strike to a more deadly target. And he says that that they only say that that they only think that way because they know that they will never fight anything outside of training weapons in a gymnasium. That he has never or 6 inches of cold steel will mess you up, right?
Right.
Go for it.
I've actually got the passage in here, so
Go for it.
I'll just read it. I have sometimes heard would-be critics in England who, be it remembered, are well aware that they are never likely to be in danger of meeting an opponent armed with anything more serious than the playthings of the fencing room. They ridicule our neighbors across the channel for so often being satisfied with a mere prick in the hand or arm. They are wrong, for it is pretty well understood that those who cultivate the habit of attacking first the more advanced parts of the adversary are, as a rule, the most careful, cool, and highly skilled swordsmen, while on the other hand, they who attempt the dangerous practice of attacking the body direct do so either from bad temper or ignorance of the art. In a serious encounter, it is not necessary, blah, 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 to take somebody's life in one thing. Terminate the combat in our own favor by disabling him. I cannot imagine a more thoroughly disabling stroke than 6 inches of cold steel through the sword hand.
Right. And I mean, to me, that's a perfect example of, we talk in some HEMA schools, especially, but or tournaments, but even lightsaber groups, I've heard it talked about that. Oh, all these tippy tappy cuts aren't going to do anything, or like, using my saber as an example, something like that wouldn't do anything. And yet here we have historical examples of people who served in the military, and that say that it would.
Right. I mean, I keep a pocket knife on my desk for opening packages. I would not start giving myself tippy tap cuts on the forearm because I don't want to get hurt.
Right. And I've never met someone that would be willing to, oh, you have a sharp sword? Well, I'll put my arm on the line, and as long as you only hit with like the last inch of it. Because I think that people are smarter than that, even if they want to lie to themselves. Because in all honesty, my wrist, I don't have big wrists, but my wrists are only like, what, 3 inches, 2 inches, something like that wide. If I catch the last 2 inches of a sword blade through my wrist, that hand is coming off. If I catch 2-inch gash across the chest, I am probably not going to be fighting for very long. If you think like I'm not a skinny dude, but like 6 inches of steel through a portion of my body, it's going to end the fight pretty quickly. So I mean, getting back to the original point and talking about the difference between the context in which these manuals were written, and there's some debate on whether or not some manuals were written for sport or for fighting. That is one of the main criticisms of Cold Steel, that people feel like Cold Steel was written primarily for fencing rather than for actual fighting. And I agree and disagree. He has some points of, well, if you're actually in a fight, do this, or you can add this in, like cut 7 and cut 8. But then you have like the Swordsman. I love the title of this: A Manual of Fence and Defense Against an Uncivilized Enemy. And this manual, yes, it starts off with foil, but then he specifically talks about later in the manual the use of saber for military context. And then if you keep going, he talks about bayonet as well, which is obviously a military weapon. And then he has the cavalry swordsman, which is in the same line, and then he has another manual that is specific to military, and they're all pretty much the same techniques. The wording changes a bit and all of that, but here we have a rare example of an author who is writing several different manuals in his lifetime, and yet also says that they work across the board, gymnasium or killing. Swetnam talks about fighting in the gymnasium, but his primary focus is the duel to the death, or not necessarily to the death, because he was a religious man who didn't want to kill people, theoretically, or at least he says so. George Silver's the same boat. He mentions the gym, but he mostly talking about the duel or the street fight, right? I feel, and it depends on the time period where you are and the context, right? Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, and I would say I think Cold Steel, I'd agree with you. Seems like Hutton wrote it with competition in mind. He even has at least one entire section dedicated to competitive, maybe 2 sections dedicated to the competitive aspect of the sport, but he constantly references, we'll do this because this would end a real fight. We'll do this because if you're in a real fight, this will make you not dead.
Yeah.
And I think he tries to write, I think he also realized that if you're fencing for sport intelligently, and like you would if swords were real, you're probably going to do a little better than somebody that's throwing caution to the wind.
Right. Unless you're doing Olympic fencing.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Or apparently kendo nowadays. I know at the bigger tournaments they're having to use high-speed cameras to see who hit each other in the head first. That is the end result. If you remove the sword portion from a sword fighting sport, then that's what you'll always end up with, is something like Olympic fencing,
Quick draw
because
contest.
everything will get quick draw contest. Everything gets optimized to the teeth, and and that's fine. Like, fencing is a great sport, but it's not sword fighting, and so I would agree that, like, if you're going to HEMA or TSL or something that still focuses on the sword fighting portion, then if you fight like that thing over there is going to kill me, then I would argue that you're going to fight better, or at least get hit less. You might not score more points, and that's something, though, like I was saying, to remember with these manuals, is just because it's not working doesn't mean it wasn't working when they wrote it. And that's an interesting side note with, like, HEMA, is that all of the different big tournaments, they have some similar rules, but they largely have different rule sets. So just because it doesn't work at SoCal Sword Fight doesn't mean it's not working. It's not going to work at Swordfish in Sweden, or at Combat Con in Vegas, or at the Arnold Classic out in the East Coast. So, bear it in mind. With just because it doesn't work in the sport that you're doing doesn't mean that it's not going to work ever. And so, to reference, like, I brought up LARP earlier, there are LARP groups, actually a fair bit of them from what I understand, that in order to block, all you have to do, using this as my blade, is to tap their blade. You don't actually have to move it offline. So a lot of the more direct cuts don't actually work. A lot of the bigger blocking motions are overkill. So that's an extreme example of being removed the other way, being removed more like watching a movie rather than just optimizing for the sport like Olympic fencing does. But yeah, I mean, just because George Silver doesn't work in lightsabers doesn't mean that it doesn't work in a sword and buckler tournament that you might go to. So,
what were we saying? Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, as we're talking about tournaments, right? Tournaments are, we've read manuals, we've practiced the things, things with other humans, as other humans are legitimately trying to hit us outside of the context of a drill. So now we're going to a tournament. And like you were saying, between Combat Con and SoCal Sword Fight and Swordfish and whatever other HEMA tournaments are out there, they have different rules. And for better or worse, some people would say for worse because they're not standardized. Some people in the HEMA community, I think, believe that's better because certain clubs like to emulate certain rules or a specific style of play. And it also keeps people... in a sense, it kind of guards the sport against turning into Olympic fencing, because if you tool your kit and your weapon for SoCal Sword Fight and how their rules are, and then you go to Combat Con and you read the rules and go, well, crap, none of my stuff's set up like that.
Right. Yeah. It prevents it from happening on a global scale. Although I would say that all that means is whoever has the most money will win the most tournaments, because they will buy the most pieces of kit to tune each kit to a different tournament. I'm not aware of anyone doing that right now, but I know, like, people like Martin Fabien he did a gear video that he has somewhere in the range of like 30 fetters and like 7 jackets or something. So he could probably do that, It's like, oh, well, I'm going to this tournament and they allow one-handed with long swords, so I'm going to pick up the lightest one so I can use it one-handed. This tournament is set up this way, so I'm going to grab this fetter. So, yeah, one last note on sparring and because it ties into tournaments as well, is tournaments are sparring is the place to try new techniques. Tournaments are not. Tournaments are the place where you have done this 1,000 times, 10,000 times. You know it works, at least in your local meta, which is something we'll hit on in a second. But it's just something that for sure works. Whereas if you were to try that with opposition, if you were to try a new technique with opposition, you're probably going to get stabbed in the face.
Yeah.
Or somewhere else gushy. Yeah, I mean, so it's something to keep in mind. Now, I mean, if you're losing like bad, like 10-0 kind of thing, which is not that bad in some rule sets and horrible in other rule sets. But if you're losing really badly, that might be the time to break out new techniques, right? Like, well, I read this in a manual, might as well throw it at the wall and see what sticks, you know? But for the most part, I would say that's not the place to do new techniques. Tournaments should be where you test the techniques that you've tried 10,000 times.
And you had said local meta. And that kind of takes us to talking about tournaments. Tournaments are where you go to step outside of your comfort zone, right?
Right.
To find out, are you a big fish in a small pond, or are you a small fish? Right. Or are you a small fish in a small pond and, oh God, I'm in the ocean and there are sharks everywhere and I'm terrified.
Right. I'm a little guppy. There are sharks. Yeah, exactly. Like, because that's one thing I know leading into TSL2, which is the international tournament that we host every year. That happened to be the second one. I definitely had big fish, little pond syndrome. I would argue that I was probably the best fighter, active fighter at least, in SoCal at the time. And I thought I was going to go out to the tournament and just win. And that is definitely not how it happened, although it did pretty well in exotics. But it's common. And the most common thing you'll see from that is the people that get super frustrated that, oh, well, why am I not winning? Or, the rules, screw the judges or whatever. And it's like, unless you got video evidence to back that up, that the judges were actually screwing you over, you don't really have room to complain, right? But it's that big fish, little pond syndrome. You want to be training for whatever meta you're going into, right?
Yeah.
So if we'll use your SCA group down there likes their short rapiers, right?
Well, I don't know if likes it, but a couple people have voiced the idea of these are what we use, and just, have came to me and been like, oh, but be prepared, because some people like these big honking rapiers because they like to play the game.
Right. Which is another subject on its own. But yeah, I mean, like, here is my Kavitan and the blade tip up there. Here is the Darkwood that I had originally to start off, which I bought used. Darkwood, just the blade. And so there's some definite height advantage that comes with that. Now, yeah, I mean, a lot of people will max out for, like, get a cup hill, get the longest thing they can for tournaments. And that's, to me, fine. In my book, that's fine, because if I was going to duel to the death, I would pick the spear over the dagger any day. I would pick the most advantageous weapon. I'm not going to use an axe. And if I'm doing like fully armored fighting to the death, I'm not going to use an axe when I could use an S-stock, right? Which is completely an optimized weapon. So I feel like all these people who argue about, the min-maxing that happens in tournaments, they don't really have a leg to stand on because we have weapons like the rapier, the S-stock, the small sword. We have so many weapons that are literally min-maxed for battlefield conditions. So I feel like they don't have a leg to stand on.
Or
It's my personal opinion.
or dueling conditions even, right? I mean,
Or dueling conditions.
a rapier in Europe at least, that was people were dueling to the death. And that weapon is what came about because of it, because people realized if I can have a long thin blade, all I need to do is stab him a couple times and he's out of the fight.
Right.
Another thing that some people in HEMA, I think, have a hard time realizing, you can put 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds of like a smaller caliber pistol, like a 9mm in somebody, and they're going to collapse on the floor. Maybe not right away, but it does damage. And essentially that's what's going to happen with a rapier. You're going to stab them, and as much as we want to think that, yes, we would power through in the power of adrenaline and will and vengeance, and I'm going to take you down with me, unfortunately for humans, the human body isn't quite that resilient.
Right. And that's actually an interesting thing. According to the FBI, and I don't know the name of it, so Google it, the name of the study, but you can Google it. According to the FBI, the most kills by any gun, if that made sense, the most kills by any gun on a national scale is 22. And it's not because the 22 is deadly. It's because that's what people have. You can go into your grandma's closet and they probably have grandpa's old 22 that he used to hunt squirrels back on the farm, or he bought it in the 60s to shoot targets or whatever. And then they go grab that and they either shoot themselves or shoot someone else. Like the 22 still kills people. And for reference, for anyone who doesn't know, the 22 is 0.22 of an inch, roughly. It is 22% of an inch, roughly, which means that it is actually a much smaller object than the tip of a rapier, an actual rapier. Because you got to remember, this is a training rapier. A real rapier wouldn't be this thin and definitely would not be this flexible. It would be thicker and it would be stiffer. So you can actually drive it through a target. Now, that's obviously, yes, you could probably find a rapier that is skinnier and more flexible because rapiers come in all sorts and sizes. But the fact that we have a cup hilt coming from Spain means that they were min-maxing back then as well. And the point of the cup hilt on the rapier is the fighting style in Spain at the time. You held the blade horizontally, straight out from the shoulder, and that way, if you have a cup hilt, if someone tries to stab your hand, then it's blocked, or your arm or your shoulder, because it's all lined up, at least to start off. The English preferred thicker bars and more bars, but they didn't really care as much about getting stabbed because they were worried more about cuts. Because the English, the Swedish, and the Danish were still using the rapier as a battlefield weapon. So they min-maxed everywhere for combat, for dueling, for sport. You best believe that Joachim Meyer had a min-max, fetter made for him by the local blacksmith, right? For what he was doing. And so, yeah. People get too hung up on min-maxing.
Right. And I mean, it's a thing that happens in tournaments. Some people are going to come in and want to play the range game, want to win. And it's arguably, again, if these were real swords, wouldn't you want a longer, sharp piece of metal than the other guy? Because it puts you further away from them. And then some people like what they like. It's either weight or style or personal preference or a combination of all of them, or they're psychopaths, and they like using something shorter than the average. And
Right.
maybe it works for them, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe the style they use allows them to do that kind of stuff, especially in the context of HEMA, where maybe you get a little more blade play and blade mechanic and being able to bind blades.
Right.
The game we play in the Saber Legion, they might as well have bacon grease on the lightsabers because they don't stick.
Right. And arguably, steel doesn't really stick that much either, comparatively. So, like, 2 steel blades, that's going to fall. No, you're good. Okay. 2 steel blades, I mean, that's probably a great sound in the microphone.
Yeah.
But, I mean, 2 steel blades, even if I get the sharper edge of this one, which is on the back, and try and bite into the sharper edge there, it's going to slide. Now, arguably, yes, sharps do stick to each other a little bit more. But if you have 2 sharp kitchen knives, go to your local store, get cheapo kitchen knives, bang them together, and see how much pressure it takes to slide them apart. And it's not much. So yeah, you'll get a moment, huh?
And
do it carefully. Actually, don't do it. Don't do it. Might do it in a later episode. Don't do that at home. If you do it at home, it's not our fault, but throw it on YouTube. But it's not our fault. Don't do it. We're not telling anyone to do it. But if you do it, throw it on YouTube. And yeah. But then you have lightsabers or polycarbonate tubing, which there's definitely less resistance. But how much does that matter, right? I would argue that if my swords were properly oiled, they'd be pretty close. But yeah, so, I mean, you can get away with it. And when we're talking about min-maxing, I'm not saying that a guy with whatever gender is going to go out with a 53 and dominate everybody who are 53-inch overall fetter and dominate everybody else who's using like a 52 or 51. I'm talking like 53 versus a 48. A bigger difference. If you're within like 2-3 inches of each other, nothing really matters. And like, oh, well, I shaved off 2 inches for weight. And it's like, how you might buy yourself some like 10 grams, 20 grams. There was a guy on Facebook the other day complaining that the VB sabers from Purple Heart Armory, which I love this thing. It's like, oh, it's 50 grams too much. That's like nothing.
And you know what a good solution to get used to those extra 50 grams? Train more.
Right. And and I mean 50 grams, that's some percent of an ounce. People can do the math at home. 2.2 kilo or 2.2 pounds equals 1 kilogram, 16 ounces to a pound. Do the math. But it's a negligible amount. And to say that you don't want to use this, now, I understand not spending the money on something that isn't perfect for what you do, but in my opinion, this is one of the better sabers on the market, even though the grip was tiny and hurt my hand. But, I understand, maybe you want to get the Steel Armory one because it's closer to what you want, like Phil Swift is using, right?
Right. Or I've got the Kavitan, the Easton saber, and I really like that. Which is essentially what you have, just a kind of a chunkier version of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, so I ran the math. Yours is about 2 ounces more than this one. It has about an inch longer blade, and it has a somewhat wider bowl that actually has rolled edges. So yours definitely will have a more durable edge. However, from what I understand, these are hardened. These are tempered and hardened, and Cavitin is not. From what I understand, I might be wrong on that. I know that the Cavitin dagger, like, I was not the dagger. Where's the dagger? I was not prepared. I was not prepared for this eventuality. The dagger, the bars were not hardened, at least not properly, because I was pretty much able to do that by hand. I got it to like here before it was a little too work hardened, and then I finished it off with a hammer. So yeah, it's not hardened. So, but the Cavitin saber has this, maybe it's not rolled, it's a forged edge maybe, because there's no roll on it that I can see, but maybe it is rolled, folded. No. But
yeah, if you want to see it, I think at least the video where we're talking about maintaining steel swords and LED sabers, if you haven't checked that out, if you go on that video, I believe I bring up that saber. We talk about it a little bit in the context of how to maintain steel swords, I believe. But
right.
It is there. I have it in another room, and I'm not going to jump up off camera and go get it because I was less prepared than Mark, and I did not have swords scattered about my floor.
At least, hey, they're leaning on workbenches. Thank you, sir.
Fair enough.
But anyway, back to the thing. Like, yes, min-maxing is important, but we have to keep in mind the realm of min-maxing. If it's marginal differences, like 50 grams on a saber, or like this being an inch shorter than your saber, if that is what makes me lose a tournament, then I should go rethink my life at that point. If I'm blaming 1 inch on a saber or 50 grams on a saber, then I should go rethink my life. I have won tournaments in TSL where my saber was, I actually won one tournament. I won my championship series fight, and then I won the tournament the next day. And then I didn't disassemble my saber, went to practice like the next week back up here in Sacramento, and found out that my setup was like 6 inches short, or like 4 inches short or something. Like, if you're really good, if you train and you put in the time and effort, min-maxing doesn't, within marginal differences, doesn't really help. But
right. And in the context of tournaments, back to what we were talking about, the marginal things, big fish, little pond. It's also where you're going to probably find the most competitive jerks. Hopefully at your local area, you're not going to be finding people you spar with doing stupid things and things that may potentially injure themselves or you, because hopefully they're good training partners and they don't want to injure anybody in their local group or that they train with. Once you get to and once you get to a bigger tournament or a national tournament, the competitive mindset kicks in, and for better or worse, some people want to win no matter what the consequences, whether it be they put you on the ground and you don't get up in some combat sports like MMA and boxing. And that's really where you're going to find out, were the things you were drilling, were the things you were sparring, do they hold up to the ultra competitive dude bro that is now swinging his fetter at you like it's a baseball bat because he is frustrated and he's just going to try and cut you in half with a blunt sword because he ran out of options.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, and that pertains very much to like the local meta, like we mentioned earlier, because there's local, there's national, and there's international metas, and so it isn't always just about that your opponent is competitive, but maybe you're studying Lichtenhauer and your opponent is studying Marasso, and Marasso has the counter to Lichtenhauer's technique of, throwing a cut this way, right? Throwing what, like, that doesn't matter, but maybe Marasso has that answer. So you need to go back and restudy the techniques and figure out why didn't this work. Rewatch the tapes. You got to do that good debrief after a tournament, and really find out, okay, this didn't work for this reason. But then, the next tournament might get messed up by someone doing a different technique, right? And so it's a constant learning and debriefing process. And so, I mean, that might be one reason, or the other reason is because your opponent is now actively trying to hit you. I feel like a lot of the times in sparring, and definitely in drills, sometimes, like we said earlier, that in drills they should be going soft. But I feel like in sparring, a lot of the times they're going soft for whatever reason, maybe because they just got off work and they're tired, or maybe because you're the experienced fighter and they're more nervous, or maybe you are just the best at your club,
Right, or maybe your, head's just not in it, but your club meets once every 2 or 3 weeks and you're not going to miss a practice.
Right. Yeah. And so someone shows up and you beat them like the baby seal they are, and you get a false positive, right? And the worst thing you can do as an opponent in sparring is to give the person you're helping train, because they're helping you train, you're helping them train. The worst thing you can do is give them false positives. But then you go to a tournament and you find out, oh, nothing I prepared for is working. My club that exclusively uses 46-inch fetters, the 46-inch fetter, I can't cover that distance. Like, I was in a live stream yesterday that I was doing for the Saber Legion. Someone commented on dual wielding, that he has had success with dual wielding against pikes, and he can reliably beat pikes. For those of you who don't know what a pike is, I think we covered it in a previous video, so go ahead and check that out. But it's essentially a 72-inch either great sword or spear, depending on the setup. And the person coming in was saying that they win, and I had to look at the camera and say and reinforce the fact that I was talking about competent pike users. And that is an example of local meta disagreeing with national meta. And that can be for a number of different reasons. But he's getting a false positive. So he's going to show up to a bigger tournament where a more experienced pike user isn't going to let him get that false positive again. And so I don't think if he does show up to a bigger tournament, I don't think he'll make it past the first round. So, and that's what can happen if your opponents are either not challenging enough, or they are not giving you the resistance that you need.
Right, and it's why, love them or hate them, I guess, to a degree, it's why every now and then it might be good to step out of your comfort zone and jump into a tournament, because it lets you test your skill set against a larger or a different pool of opponents.
Right, exactly. And another thing tournaments are great for is they set the rules of engagement, right? Where if me and Joe just go spar in the backyard, let's say we just found Zen Warrior, right? And we ordered 2 rapiers because they look cool. We want to play musketeers. We were smart, grabbed gloves. We saw that they had tunics, grabbed tunics, and grabbed a mask, because we didn't want to die, and then we just go out in the backyard and start hitting each other. And then that will probably devolve into the childlike argument that is, I killed you. No, you didn't. That I killed you. And it's like, that's one of the great things that tournaments give us, is this idea of what would actually constitute a kill. What would constitute, how long can I make it after I hit Joe? How long does he have to hit me? And that still counts. So it kind of puts us in this play. It gives us something that back in the day, when most of these manuals were written, they didn't need. And that was, how effective is a sword at killing people? Which nowadays we don't really use swords very much in combat or in self-defense. So we don't really have that frame of reference. And it's something that wasn't written in, say, Swetnam's time, but Hutton did mention in his manual, because obviously there was a change by the late Victorian era. Maybe they weren't brawling in the streets with swords as much. And so he needed to explain to people, like, yes, swords still kill people. So, and tournaments give us that.
Right. It's going to be, they're trying to get that feeling of using a real sword. Whether or not people go into it, the spirit of the event and the spirit of the attitude they're trying to invoke at the event and how people actually show up are two different things. But,
right.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's important to, like, I know you didn't when you went to your single stick tournament, but read the rules prior and train for the rules.
I read the rules a little bit. I understood. I had read the rules. I knew at least what I was getting into. And I knew that historically single stick was a saber simulator. So I was figuring I was going to do saber techniques. Some of the things I got notes on, I adapted my game the day of as best I could. I did go to my club and train single stick, but it was less me being competitive in that scenario. It was more me going and saying, I've never done this. I know I can fight with a lightsaber fairly competently, right? Showed up, would hope to think so.
Some days.
Went to TSL 4 somehow by, whatever divine being we're going to say blessed me that day. I made it to the brackets. I made it out of pools. So
in single stick.
No.
Because you said TSL 4.
Well, in TSL, I made it to out of pools and into brackets.
Yeah.
I also managed to do that in single stick somehow. Having never done it before. But with TSL, I went there because I want to win. This is the game I play. Single stick was a curiosity of, I don't think in TSL I'm anywhere near being a big fish in the pond. I'm, decent, mediocre, average on most days, can hold my own. And I just wanted to try something different and see how I did. And I mean, that's the other thing that tournaments are useful for, right? You don't need to be the competitive guy going to a tournament. Just going there to see how you do is completely valid.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. But with that, like I was saying, it is very important to read the rule set, because and in detail, and ask questions if you don't know. For example, one example I'll give is, I know the Staccato School of Defense teaches based off of English longsword, at least partially. And that's something I've been studying. And also the Guild of Knightly Arts out in, I believe, Jackson, Missouri. Whatever MO is. I think it's Missouri.
Sure, let's go with that.
Yeah, seems right. But they teach off the Liddell manuscript, and the Liddell manuscript includes one-handed cuts and thrusts with the longsword, or the sword in two hands. Because really, depending on the culture, the longsword was seen as a longer grip to counterbalance the blade, because they were making longer blades. And so when you get to the Liddell manuscript, there's talk of using it for thrusting, for cutting in one hand, both right hand and left hand. But if someone trained from the Liddell manuscript went out to Combat Con, for instance, to try out their longsword competition, they might get a warning, might get disqualified, because at Combat Con, the only time you can do one-handed techniques with the longsword is during grappling, or at least from the rule set they released for 2020, even though it's not happening this year anymore, which is sad news.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what you're doing, you might be very active in the Saber Legion, and then you go fight in a light speed tournament and you thrust someone and get disqualified, which is, in the Saber Legion, we just thrust people. In light speed, that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
So it's very important to read the rule set before you show up. At least make sure you're familiar with it, right? But like Joe was saying, it's a way to test yourself. Tournaments, at the end of the day, tournaments are just tests, right? It is a way to see, okay, with resistance, the person I'm fighting is trying actively to get me. I've put in all this time and energy. Now let's see how it goes. So yeah, I mean, it's more than anything a test. Like in school, if you think about school as an analogy for sword fighting, you have your book, you read your book, hopefully you pre-read the chapter, even though no one actually does, at least in like high school. Pre-read the chapter on math, right? Then you get to the class and your teacher stands up in front of you and gives a lecture, and does stuff on the board. And that's like drilling. It's them giving you the formulas, and maybe you do some quick formulas on the board or whatever, and you take your notes and you look at, you're getting the information. That's drilling. Sparring is like the homework, where now it's like, well, they don't want you to not be able to do the homework 100%, but they want it to be challenging enough that you learn from the thing. And then, so you learn it, you do the homework, you turn it in, cool. Then at the end of the chapter, they give you a test, and the test should be challenging enough that you had to have studied and you had to be doing it right in order to get the proper answer. And it should be challenging in that way. So a tournament is like the test at the end of the chapter or whatever, where did I actually get this right? Do I actually know this stuff? Am I actually as good as I think I am because I beat up everyone during sparring? So it's also just a fun way to hang out with people who also hit people with swords, right, or sword-like objects.
Nice way to hit other consenting adults with swords and sword-like objects.
Right.
And an important distinction I'm going to make, as I'm running out of things to say, is a big difference between sparring and the tournament. Both people are trying to hit you in both circumstances. Yeah. But in sparring, for the most part, Mark and I are sparring. Mark's trying to help me get better. I'm trying to help Mark get better. So we're not going out there and we're not going 100% all the time. Murder, kill, death, stab, stab, stab. We're going to go hard enough and with enough resistance to be effective training partners. And that's kind of the distinction between sparring locally, hopefully for you. You have respectful and mindful training partners, and being at a tournament. Somebody at a tournament probably isn't going to hold back a little bit like somebody at your local group may. Right.
No, and that's an excellent point. And I mean, I will say that when I'm going to an exhibition or a tournament or something like that, my guys up here in Sacramento know that the the last month, maybe like 2 weeks that I'm here before I go to an event, I'm going to go hard. I'm going to be fighting at the level that I will be fighting at in the upcoming event. And that is very important to do as well, because it throws off timing. It can either make or break techniques. So I would say there's some good reason to fight like that at 100% or whatever you deem safe, as close as you can get to 100%. But it is important also to train like you're at the tournament, at least for those couple weeks, right?
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, I've admitted to running out of things to say. If you got any last notes?
I think I beat that dead horse.
All right.
If anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, or anything, comments and all that good stuff.
As always, leave them in the comments if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, any corrections, retractions, anything we were wrong at, math we messed up, all that fun stuff. Let us know. We'll try to be better. I've been Joseph.
Always happy to be corrected.
Right. That's the point of the show. We're not saying we're experts. We're just trying to say we know a little bit about a lot, and hopefully some of it's interesting. And as always, I've been joined by
Mark Carrico.
There we go. And I've been Joseph Pavlenko. Thank you guys for tuning in this week. We'll be back again next week with something you guys think is hopefully interesting.